Welcome to the India Hangout. The question that we are asking today is, how bad can climate change get? An interesting report called Climate Change, a Risk Assessment, tries to understand that. It warns, among other things, that if the world warms by 4 degrees in northern India, there is a probability that 30% probability that temperatures will be so high that moderate to heavy outdoor work cannot be carried out. And this extends not just to work but also sporting activity, and then on to crops and water. So there are some serious issues, including, of course, national security. Let's understand this a little better with the author of this report, Arunabha Ghosh from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, who joins us. Also joining us is Abhishek Ghosh from Greenpeace. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Arunabha, walk us through the key highlights of this report.
Govind, thanks for inviting me. The purpose of the report is very simple: to consider climate change not as an issue that is only restricted to climate scientists and environmentalists, but to understand its implications and its interactions with complex systems. And when we begin to ask ourselves that kind of a question, we find that whether it is food stress, water stress, heat stress, issues of migration, drought, sea level rise, coastal flooding, infrastructure risk, and most importantly, national security, these are all aspects that have to be that will be affected fairly severely by a changing climate. The risks that changing climate poses will keep rising in future, and we have to make ourselves more aware of these risks, test them on a continual basis, and prepare for the response.
Yeah, right. Arunabha, so what we are distinguishing, as I can see here, is between climate change as it might happen and our understanding of risk as we know it. If you can illustrate that.
Sure. Govind, let's think of it this way. When we ask ourselves the question, what risk is there for something, we usually anticipate what is the worst that it could get. Right? So if you take out an insurance cover for your house burning down, you're not then writing an insurance for the house just warming up. You're buying the insurance cover for the house burning down. So we could ask similar questions. How bad could it get with the changing climate? But what that bad is something that society has to decide. What is it that we want to avoid? So do we want to avoid a drought that happens 5 years in a row? Do we want to avoid complete crop failure for, say, rice or wheat? Do we want to avoid a flood event that could happen once in 30 years that begins to happen once every year? Once we've determined what those thresholds are, then we have to assess how risky.
Arunabha, let me ask you the next question. Amongst the 3 or 4 situations that you've talked about water, crops, national security, migration. What is the most inevitable as things stand today? What's likely to hit us first or with the greatest intensity?
Well, the number one thing we have to keep in mind is how warm the planet is going to get. And when we assess the existing policies that countries across the world have, and we looked at the pace of technological development, and we looked at the atmosphere, we conclude that broadly, we're very certain that we are going to be crossing a 4-degree threshold. That is 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels of global average temperature. Now, if that threshold is crossed, many of the other areas that I was mentioning, whether it is human heat stress or crop yield or water stress, the risks of crossing their respective thresholds rise up fairly significantly. So that 4-degree threshold becomes a very important marker for going forward. The question then is, are we going to cross 2 degrees by mid-century, by the end of the century, or by the middle of the next century? That will depend on the policies and the actions.
Right. Okay. Abhishek, let me come to you. Abhishek, what's your sense? I mean, you campaign a lot for renewable energy. Obviously, I mean, campaigning against fossil fuels and so on. How do you read this report or the contents of this report, and how urgent is it, or is it as urgent as it sounds it is?
Well, what Arnaba has already talked about, the climate change is not only a scientific issues, or it's not like only in a temperature rise. There's a lot of consequences, and these climate change consequences is also not as a faraway thing. It's not going to happen in future. It's already happening. If you see there's a delay monsoon this year, or there's in parts in area I'm right now in Patna in Bihar, and we are facing a deficient rain this year. And a similar situation is another part of the country in the eastern part of. So this is clearly an impact of the climate change is there, and the climate change is not only, a lot of time has been talked about that either climate change is an environmental issues or climate change is economic issues. But I would say that the climate change is more in a human issues. There's a human impact. There is an impact on the human survival, and there is also an impact on the survival of all kinds of the living organisms. So what the issues are point out of the migration, it is there. It's also about the increased poverty in the region which are already facing extreme poverty.
Right.
And if you see that this report, last year the German Watch has released a report, and in that report where they assess the vulnerability index of all the countries in relation to the climate change, India has been at the number 2 after the Philippines. And it's one side is maybe has a high economic growth in the country, but there is also an extreme possibilities of the climate impact in the regions which are not so developed. And therefore, for the risk of the climate change in India is a far more severe than compared to the many other nations.
Right. Arunabha, let me put this question to you. So 2 questions actually. So first one is that does the data, I mean particularly in the study that you've done, suggest that we are seeing secular instances of climate change already? For instance, would a delayed monsoon this year or it's not exactly delayed, but let's say unpredictable monsoon behavior be part of something longer and secular, or is it something that's one-off which may have happened in the past as well? And the second thing is, of course, the impact of economic growth and prosperity on this very issue that we're talking about.
So, Govind, it's all climate scientists will tell you that it is foolhardy to try and associate individual weather events with climate change. What climate change is doing is basically shifting the curve. It's shifting the averages, shifting difference from what we expect to something that we've not dealt with. So if you think about our monsoon, every year, whether there's a 10% increase in rainfall or there's a 10% decrease in rainfall, for a sort of rain-fed agricultural economy that we are, it has severe implications. You get unseasonal rains, your crops wither. You don't get the rains, your crops wither. So the point is that if just 10% modulation in the rains has such a big impact year on year, what happens when you have not a 10% change, but a 20%?
Abhishek, let me come back to you. Have you at Greenpeace done any statistical or database study on how climate change could evolve, and how bad is it today versus how bad it could get in future? I mean, you could use any particular instance. I mean, it's not necessary. I mean, I'm not talking about the whole gamut, but any particular instance that you, or geography that you want to focus on.
Well, we did one assessment which we do periodically since 2006 on which we call as an energy revolution. Basically, we looking at the scenarios that on how there is already an impact of the climate change are visible in many regions, which are particularly not so developed regions. And we've seen that in our own energy revolution report, that if there is an economic growth you have, let's say in countries like in Europe or America, you have a certain level of climate resilience to fight with that. But when you're in a region like in India or South Asia or Africa, where there is an economic prosperities are not there, there is a less ability to fight the climate resilience. But again, there is a very vicious cycle. If you start doing an economic prosperity based on the fossil fuel, you are adding more and more carbon into the atmosphere, which lead to the more of the climate impact in those regions first, where there is already a high vulnerability. So in all our assessment, what we understand and what we are actually suggesting and recommending, that we need to move away from the current carbon intensive growth model toward a model which has a sustainable, which is not a resource intensive, and which based on a kind of a technology which can be long lasting, which can be renewable. Energy sector is definitely, we have to look into the sustainable modes of energy like solar and winds. But overall, in terms of the economy, we also have to shift away from the resource intensive growth model to a less, more, I would say, the more sustainable kind of a model.
Right.
And sorry, one more point I would like to bring here in terms of what Anuruba talking about change in weather pattern. Maybe there is a change of weather pattern, but it's in terms of the rain is, for example, we know that in July, in the beginning of July, we don't get in this kind of heavy rainfall. Already those crops like in the maize and other crops are there, have been washed away because of the heavy rain. And now when you have a paddy cultivation, the rain is not available, and then you have to do a more rely on the groundwater for irrigation, which means that you are also overutilizing your whatever the resource, which is a depleting resource. So it is in a very vicious cycle starting within a climate change. It's stressing on the whatever the available resources are.
Right. So Arunabha, two points again. So one is focus on economic growth and derive the prosperity that comes from it. But that also, while it exposes you to higher risk, it also allows you to actually build the infrastructure to become more resilient. So which way would countries or should countries like India go?
No, Govind, there is no question out here that have the economic or the social resilience to deal with climate shocks, nor do you have the technological developments that are needed. You need the economic growth. The question really is the pattern of growth. So if you take resilience against, say, flooding, we find in the report that the incidence of a 1 in 100-year flood could increase by 1,000 times, which means that the same flood would be happening 10 times over by the end of the century in a single year. Now, what kind of resilience and infrastructure do you need for a major urban center like that? You can't build in that resilience unless you have the resources. So New Orleans, as an example, put in $15 billion after Hurricane Katrina to shore up its defenses. And even then, its population still remains half of what it was in 2005, 10 years ago, when Katrina struck. Right? So do we have $15 billion to put in city after city? So we will need the economic growth. It's the pattern of growth and the choices we make that is going to be crucial. Just to take another example, we've got this very aggressive target for renewable energy, which is a great thing. We're trying to reach, say, 100 gigawatts of solar. Now, what that means is between now and 2022, by when we have to hit that target of 100 gigawatts of solar, it means a compounded annual growth rate of 8%. That's like superhuman effort in a single industry just to get solar up to So again, it will drive growth, it will drive technological change, it will drive prices down on new energy technology, but it will take policy, finance, human capability, engineering talent, and minerals and materials resources to come together in a strategic way to be able to deliver on those kinds of aggressive targets.
Right, and which obviously would bring us to the next question of how prepared are we and how willing are we to embark on some of these projects or down that path. Let me get Prachi in if we finally got her. Prachi, you mean you've done this report for India Spend. Walk us through what else you've put together in terms of facts and figures around this, around climate change as we've talked about today.
The report, firstly, I would like to point out, it was a much needed report which was supposed to come out on climate change mitigation and the impact of climate change. But we also found a few figures that were put together by the Ministry of Program Implementation, which kind of highlighted the increase in deaths due to heat waves, also deaths due to droughts and cyclone storms which have been on the increase. So we have put together all these other data sources, but what is going to happen in the future, this report by CEW has brought it out very well. I just had one question.
Go ahead.
For Anurag. So when we say this, the first part that you say on mitigation, so when we suppose India does manage to move to much more renewable sources of energy, invest more in public transport and things like that, so does that change the risk assessment for future?
Sorry, I didn't get the last bit of that question. Does that mean what? Pardon me?
I wanted to ask the risk assessment, right? So if India does do the right set of moves, like increase in dependence on renewable energy, increasing the number of public transport and brings down its emissions, so do the risk assessment changes then again?
Oh, that's an excellent question, because the point about looking at a risk assessment is that, number one, you will not have the same policies that will be applicable year on year on year. And number two, you will not have the same threats that will be applicable year on year on year. The question is a risk of, say, flooding or drought as it occurs today, given the information we have today, that allows you to build in certain policies. But if you just let it go and say, okay, we've done our bit and we have to do nothing else, that's not sufficient. You have to do this as a continuous exercise. So what you might be able to deal with today will not be necessarily sufficient for what kind of risk is imposed on us in future. Take this as an example. When you look at earthquakes, which have nothing to do with climate change, but when you look at earthquakes, the probability of an earthquake happening in geological time is around the same. So you don't know when an earthquake is, right? But you know in a particular region what the probability is based on long-term data series of tracking. With climate change, that stability is not there. The risks are actually non-linear. They rise over time. They're not stable over time. So unless you're able to do continuous risk assessment, you will not be able to figure out whether your policy responses of today are sufficient for 2020 or the policy responses of 2020 are sufficient for 2050. The last point is that it's not enough just to do a risk assessment of your own country. What happens in your neighboring countries will impact your human systems as well. Your financial market, your national security, your trade, your coastal infrastructure, and so forth. So it's important to understand how much we can do on our own and how much we require other countries to chip in as well. Right. This exercise is not about commitments in climate negotiation. This is about understanding a risk that is going to increase over time and preparing ourselves by continuously assessing it.
Right. Thank you so much, Arunabha, for that. Let me get a quick summation from Abhishek. Abhishek, quick, sort of word. If we were to now look at all of this and look ahead, what are the one or two things that we need to do? I mean, not at an individual level. I think that part we all know. At a policy strategic level.
Sorry, I can't hear you the last sentence.
No, the question was, if we were to now look forward and were to, bring in more urgency into what we have to do, how do we do it at a policy and strategic level, not so much at an individual level?
Well, on the policy and strategic level, definitely we need one clear analysis. I think then there's a very excellent report what Anuruba's organization has done that. But at the next stage, at least in the government's level, we need to do some level of a backcasting assessment. Because there is one thing is very clear that the climate change is happening and there is an impact on India itself. So India has to assess that at what growth level we need to grow. We are talking about sometimes 7%, sometimes 8%, sometimes 9%. We need to decide that at what growth level for the next at least 30 years, at what growth level we need to grow. And on the basis of that, we need to decide that what kind of an energy infrastructure we need to build. And accordingly, other kind of infrastructure also we have to develop. Second thing, renewable energy targets are very good, what government has proposed. But we need to also put a lot of things in line. There is a target but at policy level, whether there is a procurement of those energy will be available in the grid. If developers are putting such kind of projects, whether our grid are available to take those electricity. So those are reforms first at the policy level and also at implementation level. We need to do it very quickly. Otherwise, we will again in next 5 years, we are debating the same issues of the risk of the climate change and at the much grave situation, much more severe situations. And nothing can be done because already the damage has done enough.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. Last word, Arunabha. What's the one thing that you are going to be focusing on as EEW to take this report forward?
Well, the one thing we want to do is to take this analysis, which has been done across the globe with more than 40 scientists from around the globe, 5 lead authors, including myself, from UK, US, China, and India. We want to take this down to a more granular India level. So while we have a lot of India analysis, what we'd like to see is, do we have better information that we can provide state governments? Do we have better information that we can provide city governments? So risk assessment happens at different levels. It starts with the household and goes all the way up to the international level. But we've got to first understand what is the kind of questions that policymakers are asking or would need answers for, and then we got to try and answer them.
Thanks, Arunabha. Thanks, Abhishek and Prachi. We've run out of time. We're going to be back on India Hangout very soon with more interesting and exciting topics. Stay tuned.